Mhm. Oh, good. Nicholas is here. Good afternoon. Good morning, Nicholas.
Hello. Hello. Good morning.
Hi. Good to see you here.
Hi. Nice to see you.
Dr. Radhawat is here. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good morning, actually.
Good morning.
Sir, shall we start?
Sure. Ah, Toshiko is here with a very colorful background.
Yeah, this is Polish.
Good.
Nice seeing you, Toshiko, and congratulations on making editor.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank you very much.
congratulations. Congratulations.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
And the Kumamon that I saw next to you,
Yeah.
loving it.
To everyone here on the panel and other listeners, we would like to announce that Dr. Toshiko Kikukawa has just become our editor of the Simulations and Gaming Journal, which is the official journal of the ISAGA. I don't know the official date, whether it's from the 1st of January or for a year back or a month, I'm sorry, a week back. I don't know when the effective date. Maybe you must tell us, Toshiko, a little later.
Yeah, but it's official,
Okay.
so it's okay now.
Mr. Pali, probably you could begin.
Yes, sir. Sure. So, hello everyone present here and welcome to the webinar organized by International Gaming and Simulation Association and Shri Vaishnav Vidyapeeth Vishwavidyalaya, Indore, India. Today's webinar is on the history of simulation, games and what it donates, serious gaming, gamification and learning with games movements. And it's our pleasure that we have a speaker in the webinar, Dr. Thomas Hervienen, Associate Professor of Information Practices at Tampere University, Finland. And it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker of the session. Dr. J. Thomas Hervienen is Associate Professor of Information Practices at Tampere University, Finland. He is a former co-editor of Simulation and Gaming and an ISAGA Advisory Board member. Dr. Harvinen's work spans several disciplines and has been published in channels such as Organization Studies, Journal of Business Ethics, Journal of Documentation, and Games and Culture. So, on behalf of the organizing committee, I once again welcome to Dr. J. Thomas Harvinen for the webinar and request him to please start the session.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes.
I will not, in this lecture, be going into details about exact games because we have people attending here who are far more familiar with the actual games that have been produced within the ISAGA community and the other communities over the last 50 years. So what we will be talking about today are trends, but feel free to raise points at any time if you feel like it to question what I will be presenting. This is a work based on what I have seen as an editor for both books and for the ISAGA community and simulation and gaming. So trying to more raise questions here maybe than actually provide direct answers, although some of my opinions will of course be included here. So the point that I'm making is as said, the history of simulation games and what it denotes for serious gaming, gamification, and learning with games movements. Because one of the key problems that I see in our field is that people have been reinventing the wheel often, and then again a few times. So we can identify at least 4 waves, 3 of which have become very influential, but we can't actually say what exactly we've learned because a lot of the work that's been done on learning with games, and I'm intentionally using the phrase learning with games, that comes from Nicola Witten instead of game-based learning, which expects that the games are the things that are creating a change here. So we have some ideas on how they work, but as Jan Klabbers wrote 18 years ago, we don't actually have a theory of how this really functions. And almost 2 decades later, I still agree with the idea that we don't really know how this functions or why, but we know that it does, which is one of the greatest things on what we are doing. So we still get to experiment with these things. All pictures here are cited under Creative Commons, mostly come from Wikipedia or other sources, just sort of making this copyright note here. And then we go into the actual facts. So very often when we talk about the history of educational gaming, we get to the year 1812. So von Reiswitz and the Kriegspiel, and then its commercialized version, or what we can think of as at least a packaged version in 24. But even though this has been quite likely the key moment for the development of educational and operational gaming, which we can take very seriously, it is not the first step. Nevertheless, it is good to remember that when we start to talk about the way in which the use of games for instrumental purposes developed, the first step was a military game. Then we had retiring officers who went into business, and that was the next step. And after this, we had medical simulations and other areas. So whenever someone says that, well, games are just recreational and fun and we should sort of not think about them seriously, it's best to remember that they are first and foremost something that has a history where they've been applied in areas where failing was extremely problematic. So actually, the history of using games for educational purposes comes from the very areas where we really needed to be able to test things out before they were applied in practice. War, business, medicine. So this is the area where we've actually developed the traditions that we're talking about. However, if we really go a bit back, let's say 5.5 millennia back, we are seeing games like Mancala or Avale or whichever other dozens of names this gaming actually has. So placing pearls or small stones or something like this within a game board, and mathematics tells you if you have scored something or you have not. So the oldest games that we actually know within the history of humanity are based on science and technology learning topics. So actually STEM gaming is older probably than our ability to write things. And this, I think, is a very valuable point. The first games we know have required the learning of new knowledge in order to be able to play them. And therefore, the idea that game study started in 2001 or that learning games became active in 1970, it's not an actual fact that has been taking place. We have been using games for learning purposes and for operational knowledge and so forth for millennia, and this is something that I want people to keep very strongly in mind. And I see Elizabeth already active there in the video, so hopefully getting some comments later on this. But when we go to formalized gaming, so first military simulations, beginning of the 19th century of the current era, and then a lot of analog games, so board games, some of them from the current perspective highly offensive, others very accurate still, thinking about, let's say, the different versions of Monopoly, the landlord's games, and so forth early on. But in 46, we get the first computer simulation game, the so-called war game, which still used punch cards and everything. So again, we come back to the point where we have military gaming happening first, and then we get next a business game, the management business simulation, which was known with different names and was documented then by its designers. So Kibi and Kraft and Nanus in the second edition of this book. So I think 1962 would be the right year for this happening, and 69 the next edition. But we see the first developments of some kind of systematic research on educational gaming, or more properly, I would say instrumental gaming in the early 60s. A colleague and I, he's working on his doctoral dissertation on the topic of playability for games. We went through all of the early works and we found something, I think it was from Kraft, that in the late 50s is the first time that we actually see someone mention the idea of playability for something. So a lot of the terminology that is currently being reinvented or reused has actually been found first within operational gaming and educational gaming research quite a lot of time before. And I like making jokes about game studies with Espen Arset declaring that 2001 was the first year of game studies, that, well, ISAGA people had been at it for 31 years before that, and some scholars whose work we have forgotten to a large extent had been at it another 10 years before. So we are working on a very fine tradition where the pieces are finally and luckily finding, in my opinion, each other nowadays. So this is a very positive development. Then I would jump to the next step. So the year 1970. We have SAGSET. I've had the pleasure of receiving an almost entire and complete collection of their journal from a colleague who has been retiring. But we also have ISAGA, and we see the birth of Simulation and Gaming as a journal. Of course, these works do not come from any kind of vacuum. Like I mentioned, we already see that there have been at least 20 years of developments on this topic before this, but the formalization of the works through certain researchers, and I want to especially emphasize practitioners. Kathy Greenblatt is an excellent example of people who had already been testing things and documenting things and bringing them forth. This is where we see the birth of this journal. And since this is going on video, I want to congratulate the new editors. So Toshiko, you are here present, and Marike is probably going to see this later. So this is very important. We have a channel that raises things that the more cultural studies oriented journals, which encompasses most of game studies journals, do not pick up. So it is important to remember that we have very different traditions in this field, which brings me to the early 70s and three very influential volumes which have raised points that are very significant in this area. In the middle, we have Duke's Gaming the Future's Language, which is sort of often seen as the ISAGA Bible. It's a heavy read, and like the Bible, it is a book where you either sort of can agree or disagree and then form your own opinion of it. We could relate it to a lot of other religious literature as well. But the point here is that Duke was able to consolidate a lot of the work that had been done by previous scholars within educational sciences, within several practitioner movements, and so forth. So this established the kind of the approach that people have been taking to the academic study of games. But interestingly, Duke's work is often dismissed within the educational sciences community, and it is by and large completely unknown within, for example, the Digital Games Research Association, DIGRA group. So saying like this happened in the 70s, like, whoa, what is taking place here? And this is something to keep in mind. So framing it the right way is very important. To the left, we have Clark Abbott's Serious Games, which was nicely promoted in the other highly influential book, Salen and Zimmerman's The Rules of Play. But what Abbott's work has, to a large extent, led to has been the idea that sort of we need to separate operational or instrumental gaming, which is serious, from gaming that is done for recreational purposes. But any of us who have actually played, let's say, Civilizations, one version with children, or Assassin's Creed or something like this, we know they are perfect boundary objects for bringing into discussion what is realistic here and what is not, and so forth. So I would say that the division between entertainment or recreational gaming and serious gaming is completely artificial, and it's done after the first steps more damage than it has actually brought us good things. But one of the results of this book and the concept of serious games is that instead of using what had been developed for simulation gaming since at least the 70s or the 40s, if I may be bold, was that in the early 2000s, people completely rediscovered the idea of using games for learning and instrumental purposes. And we see this reflected nowadays in a lot of research. So I have a book about 600 pages called Serious Games from 2009, and I think I found one reference in the entire volume to something that had been done within the ISAGA community or simulation and gaming. And to me, this says a lot about sort of how difficult it has been for these communities to communicate with each other. I've also heard rumors that several prominent ISAGA members were not happy about having their work shared and thus did not want to sort of join with these communities, but I let the old timers who know a lot more about this say more about the topic. The third book here is a very interesting case. Apologies for the blurry image. So it's Carlson and Miss Hauk's Introduction to Management Decision Simulations. Sorry, can't see the cover behind the videos, but it's basically 20 pages of theory followed by a lot of code given to people so that they might produce their own first business simulation. But what Carlson and Miss Hauk point out, to which I will return a bit later, is, for example, challenge levels, difficulties, playability, things like these. So the idea of actually fine-tuning your game to a level where people will find it challenging enough, but not too challenging. And this is something we're seeing readdressed now through different channels. And Carlson and Miss Hauk, they do not go really deep into this, but they are already showing awareness of the difficulties of these areas. And I have these three covers here at the same time to remind us of the fact that we on one hand have the serious games movement that emphasizes the use of recreational games for learning purposes. We have the simulation and gaming tradition here in the middle, emphasizing both learning and, on the other hand, recreational games and the way in which games allow us to see complete systems. And then we are thirdly having here a business simulation book, which, while talking about the practicalities of instrumental gaming, is actually also taking into account the very basics of what we are nowadays seeing in game design literature, in game studies, in game culture studies, and so forth. So we've actually been working on this stuff since the 70s. What we haven't been doing is talking with each other sufficiently. Then the next step that I want to bring forth comes in the early 90s. I think 93 would be the right year for this one. This is the newer version of former ISAGA board member Timo Lainema's Real Game. So until the early 90s, within instrumental gaming and operational gaming, we had very strong traditions of turn-based decision making. And then in the 90s, we suddenly start to see a move towards real time, which is emphasized in several articles. For example, the work of Enrico Gandolfini in Simulation and Gaming and a few others. So there's a definite switch to suddenly, and I want to really emphasize the wording suddenly, understanding that if we have moved to a digital platform, the work can provide far more realistic results and can be graded in different perspectives and so forth. So Laineman's work, Presha Tavikulvat's work, and a few others has been really influential here. And it's a move to seeing ISAGA community work approach the ways in which recreational gaming is working. It was the first step, in my opinion, to actually connecting these communities in a way where people can be seeing their common strengths. And I still think this game, even though it looks like Excel sheets, is one of the most addictive games I have ever played. So I am highly in favor of good business simulations. Then next jump to the early 2000s. Two books, both of which were based on a lack of information, their conjecture, but both have been highly influential. And I'll take the best first. So James Paul G., professor of I think linguistics, 2003, What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy. So a professor working within education, studying children playing games and saying these might be learning points that we could take from this work to expand what we currently know. G is making no assertions. Others have confirmed practically all of G's points in that book, and it's become one of the central references in this field, also for the purposes of gamification, to which I will return shortly. Then we have Prensky. Anecdotes, conjecture, single cases from which he claims that we learn from digital games and everything is brilliant, and this is the new learning approach, and we have digital natives, despite the fact that knowing how to use Snapchat doesn't actually translate to any skills with Excel. But it has something like 6,000 citations, mostly because I think nowadays everyone who needs to refute the book needs to cite it. So he's seeing like hate citations more and more these days. But if we're honest, these two books were the ones that transformed the field and brought us what we nowadays consider serious gaming that has become active from the basic roots of digital games research. So they need to be noted, even if I, for example, do not agree with one of these. Later on, we come to the next steps. These, I think, are both from 2014. So I'm a big fan of the way in which Nicola Witten moved with her work alone and with Alex Mosley towards the idea that we should be talking about learning with games instead of game-based learning, which was the earlier step, or even simulation and gaming. And Harald Varmeling's book on online gaming and playful organization is an excellent example, in my opinion, of the ways in which we have been moving from just gaming and instrumental gaming towards playfulness, gamification, and how to also be critical about it. At the same time, however, we have been seeing new movements in this area. And one of the most interesting ones has been design gaming, which the first examples of which also appeared already in the 70s, but over the last 10 years have become far more popular. So things that don't actually, from the perspective of someone who has been involved in game studies or games research, they don't actually seem like games that much. So no winning goal, no competition. We go very deeply into Kalua's ideas here, but games where the function is to actually structure turn-based discussion, to give room to the more quiet people and so forth. So something that we would no longer recognize probably as a game, but which is still called a game. We did a special issue for simulation and gaming on these kinds of games in 2016, so I highly recommend people look it up. Here's my personal favorite, Topasia. I am not involved with this company, but this is a game that I really like, where you do organizational development by choosing one card which is on a certain topic. Let's say the most difficult thing in our organization. Everyone has 5 cards and they offer different alternatives. You play these on the table and then you discuss together which is actually the thing that we need to develop the most. So the entire concept of what we are seeing as instrumental and effective gaming is being broadened as we speak, and as soon as we can get back to ISAGA conferences face to face, I will bring some examples of these things to these events. On the other hand, we are moving also towards roleplay. This is an educational role-playing session that is taking place here. And like my colleague said, that if we had actually read the work done by Krukol, Oxford, and Saunders back in '87, the whole role-playing community, which is using these kinds of techniques, might be using very different terminology in the area. But more and more, the game doesn't look like a game. It is likely looking like theater in drama, something like this, which brings us directly to gamification. This is a stolen picture from a Facebook group, but chocolate-covered broccoli, as is the typical definition for gamification. So adding just some of the elements from gaming to everyday life activities. And it's been a very long tradition. The concept of gamification is less than 2 decades old, but the idea of gamifying activities is a lot older, and this is where also the ideas drawn from the games that I mentioned before come into play, pun intended. So what we have here is Comrade Stakhanov, the Russian workers' hero, but China had its own and others as well. And if we think about the kind of idea of points, badges, and leaderboards, the Boy Scouts were doing this for 100 years. Even more strongly, the pioneers, based on them who were in the Soviet region, follow these same principles. So you do something, you get a badge. So the idea of gamifying activities has been with us for a very long time. And therefore, the question is not whether these mechanics work, it's about which mechanics are we actually using and which systems are we using. Employee of the month is a gamification method that's taking place in most McDonald's and other similar places. So actually we are seeing this all the time, and we need to think about how to relate to gamification instead of what kind of gamification is currently happening. Richard Landers, who I think is the leading expert on the topic of educational gamification, has in 2014 in Simulation and Gaming again published a theory of gamified learning. So we have game characteristics, behavior and attitude, instructional content, and the learning outcomes. And these all influence each other. The same year, no, 1 year later, Landers and Landers published a work on testing this theory. So if anyone wants to study the use of educational gamification, take these, and then the Landers et al. Work 2 years ago in the Jan Klabber's special issue of Simulation and Gaming. But what we see here is that the game design itself is insufficient. It affects behavior or attitude, and this is then combined with the instructional content, which in turn leads to results. So we cannot trust simply the idea that if we add some points or leaderboards or storification to an existing activity, let's say municipal planning, which I've been researching with Lobna Hassan, these are things that actually need to influence a person. And most of the literature that you read on this topic will say that we follow Decky and Ryan's ideas on how this turns through gamification. The activity turns external goals to internal goals. But if you don't actually know motivational psychology and haven't delved deeply enough into it. It's just going to be activities where you have a novelty effect. People will be enjoying the game or game-like activity in the case of gamification for 2 months, and then everything that you've thought is a good thing for the activity is something that will drive them away from what they're actually doing. Hamari and Koivisto's work from 2014 point this out very clearly. So, to draw ideas from what I've been talking about here, this is from my work with Mikko Meriläinen, who's an educational scientist specializing on games. Educational content needs, for the purposes of operational gaming, be present throughout the entire process. The challenge level has to be heavy enough so that people actually get clear feedback for what they're doing, but on the other hand, they don't have to struggle too much or too little. So if the challenge level isn't good, people will abandon the game. Same with engagement. So the game has to be interesting enough, but not so interesting that the next step, which is reflection, gets damaged, because oftentimes when we're too engaged with a game, then we don't actually think about what we are doing. This is why SNG and the ISAGA community are talking so much about things like debriefing and facilitation and things like this. So this is essential. So engagement comes from the challenge, but is often an enemy to reflection. So we need to balance these things. And then, as pointed out by Richard Landers, the educational content needs to be there the whole time. Otherwise, we will not see the last point from this equation, which is the learning. Of course, if we're doing games just for the purpose of recreational fun, then we don't need to think about this, just the first 2 points. But within ISAGA, I think we're really interested in the last 2 points. So it comes down to the so-called 1-2-1 equation. Briefing, play, debriefing, making sure that we do not trust stealth learning. We are actually making sure that the participants are learning the right things. This is in educational sciences, a thing called unfreeze, freeze, unfreeze kind of approach, or the other way around. Thomas Duus Hendriksen's work done a decade ago is where we see the best examples of this for game-based learning. And then my last point on the list is that when we are using games for operational purposes, and this is something that we have really learned over the last 50 years, is that we have 3 different purposes. Are we teaching something that is actually new? Is the game supposed to teach you something, whether it's the alphabet for children or whether it's running a real-time business, or if it's learning new things? Or are we providing chances to experiment? For example, a lot of business gaming does its best work not in the case of teaching people to use new skills. It's so that they have been studying how to run a business, and then they have chances to experiment. As Tsukiya Sensei has written, the best and most important thing a flight simulator can give us is that we can crash safely in numerous ways. And this is one of the key purposes why using, for example, business gaming and other similar tools is so good. And the third goal, which goes quite close to the second one, but is not exactly the same, is that oftentimes when we are studying something, if we can't apply it in practice, we forget what we have learned. So instead of experimentation, it's sometimes very good that we can play games so that we can try stuff out, and then we retain those in our memories. It's usually good to also get to experiment at the same time, but not always. So knowing for what purpose one is deploying a learning game can be highly important, and this also goes for gamification, because we sort of need to think about these things. Then one more point I want to raise here through the work of Yasmin Kafai, Quinn Burke, and also Karen Schreier's work is that more and more, instead of gamification or game-based learning or learning with games, people are learning by making games. Outi Laitis' doctoral dissertation approved 2 months ago is a wonderful example of this. So game jams, game creation, any sort of so-called pressure cooker approaches, this is where I see the future of our field. So learning by developing is where we are moving more and more. And I would be surprised if future ISAGA conferences would not be featuring more and more works within this area. And this goes also for researchers, because when we develop, we learn, we develop new theories and so forth. And ISAGA, of all the organizations within this field, and I'm also counting in the Game Developers Association, ISAGA has the longest tradition of actually learning by developing games and creating new ideas and learning from each other. And I think this is one of the biggest strengths of our entire community. Hands in the clay, we're working with these all the time. So my quick summary at the end: learning games, doing ISAGA style stuff, it's a tradition of at least 55 centuries. I think that's a good pitch. We've been computerized since the mid 1940s. We've had systematic research since the 1970s, but already research that has been taking place in the 60s. The wheel's been reinvented twice in the early 2000s, first by Digra and then by the serious games movements. And we are now working together increasingly, which I find fantastic. So we're finally seeing the cross-pollination that should have been taking place 50 years before already. Jams and other quick production forms are a rising trend in learning. With games, and still, as I said, Clubbers pointed out 18 years ago, we're still very much working with a black box. So we know some of the basics, but we don't know what actually work, which parts are working, and thus we need a lot more research in this area. And as my final note, I leave this picture from gamification scholar Sebastian Deterding here. So it's a complex field, and we often simplify it too much. So we have serious games, we have gamiful design, toys, playfulness, and then we have the whole field of recreational gaming that takes place outside of this, and which we can more often than we believe or remember use also for teaching and research purposes. So know what you're designing and whether it's going to be a complete system or if it's going to be elements of a system applied to what you're working with. And here I conclude my speech and will answer any questions.
I request panel members to please ask questions.
I invite Dr. Vinod Damlekar sir to conduct the Q&A session. Dr. Vinod, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Dubey. Marcus, you covered 5,500 years in the space of 45 minutes. Thank you very much. You covered a number of issues which probably were not very visible to us. Most prominently, the issues of serious games, which has been quite a topic amongst the simulation and gaming fraternity, and especially the ISAGA fraternity. I would like to ask some of the ISAGA and other members here for their comments before we go ahead. If there is anybody who would like to ask other questions, probably you could ask in the chat box. I'll read that for the benefit of the speaker here, that is Thomas. If there is nobody who would like to volunteer, probably I'll begin with Marcus. May I ask you, because you are the newest member of this panel, let me introduce Marcus very quickly. From Australia, a very visible and active member of Simulation Australia. And I hope he will speak here one of these days. Marcus, may I ask you to give us some questions to probe?
Firstly, I'd like to say it was a great presentation. It's lovely to see people reaching back into the history and realizing these things are regularly repeated. So one of my questions is, what are we going to do about the recognition of cognitive learning? So in developmental psychology and other areas of cognitive learning, serious games have played a part of the methodologies to create their experiments and to run their experiments. But my colleagues in psychology would not recognize they were doing serious games with the children.
Yeah, this is an excellent point. I will answer this and then Claudia's question in the chat next. So I think framing here is crucial. So we're seeing a lot of terminology in this area and distortion of what a game means, which is why I always go back in these lectures to the fact that the first areas where we applied as humans these technologies. I see gaming as a technology, were warfare, business, and medicine. So areas where we really need to be able to apply the stuff seriously and try out. And as I mentioned, based on Tsukiya's seminal work, the idea that we need environments where we can fail safely. But my ex-wife is a teacher. She uses games to help students learn spoken English. And she always introduces the role plays with the word that this is the stuff that we'll do. And then at the end of this session, usually there's one student who says that this was really like, live action role playing, which I do. So it's setting the box of expectations the right way.
So I think a lot of that is done is the core part of the experiments that developmental psychologists use to create their control groups and their test groups.
Yeah.
And so therefore the majority of our cognitive modeling is based on games without it truly being recognized as that's where it comes from. And if you look at early education of children in underdeveloped world places, you'll find games will be used in gathering tasks. So in fact, I think gamification may predate war, may actually date back to survival skills that were required throughout history. The problem is, because it's so universal, it's hard to see where the control comes in, and that makes serious gaming the important distinction. But we do need people to recognize that they may be doing it as a subset, and it may be a core part of the majority of human basic research.
Yeah, I have a hobby of purchasing myself more and more business simulation literature from the 60s, which often tries to sort of stay as far as possible away from the concept of anything being like a game. And it's been an enlightening reading list to many extents. One of the things, and why I wanted to include Deterding's picture in the list, is that what we need to still think about always when applying these approaches is whether we're designing entire systems, which would be a serious game or a simulation, or if we are applying elements from these to the activities, which would be closer to, like I mentioned, employee of the month. So where is our systems design? Because when you are designing a good serious game or a good game of any kind, you're able to control the immediate feedback in that system or the possibility of failure and so forth. But if you're doing gamification, it's very different, because you're blurring then everyday life, or in the case of a pervasive game, some parts of everyday life, with the risk that an actual failure will cause harm. So the affordances of these activities are very different from each other, and thus I find it somewhat risky that they are so often blended in discussions. And this goes to the question raised by Claudia on the list, that the surrounding culture is highly significant here. In Finland, for example, we've been having a project called the Player Barometer, run by Frans Maura, for 2 decades. And we know that here about 5% of people do not like to play any sort of game. And some of those don't like it because they're too competitive, others because they find it irrelevant and boring, others who simply don't like framing activities as games. And this is super important when we think about other environments where people try to apply these approaches, that we really need to take into account the fact that it's not something that everyone loves, no matter what Bernie de Koven argued back in the day. It's something that fits some, and the cultural differences can be huge. One of my favorite documents is from the 16th century, which talks about a horrible activity that distorts gender roles, lures people into performing violent actions by way of fictional crimes, and wastes time, which we call now theater. So the whole issue of the cultural surroundings that defines how we relate to these activities are highly important, and I think should be considered a lot more in the research as well, even though we are seeing very good summaries of tests on the efficiency of gamification.
Any other questions, please?
Yeah, very nice presentation. I am Dr. Rajesh Shukla
Yes,
from
sir.
Sri Vaishnava Vidyalaya.
Yes, sir.
Actually, you have covered that cultural dimensions and the psychological. So just extending related to this, the question is that how does behavior or attitude should be gauged or characterizing in the gaming?
Another excellent question. Yeah, I'll have to think about this a bit. From my perspective, I think we should more and more, when we are trying to make any sort of predictable works in this area, focus not on gamifying things, but on creating games and placing those in the right locations of curricula, so that we can actually control the factors that are there. And this is something that's too easily stepped outside of. So people throw in these tools and do not go with the 1-to-1 approach, and instead they think that if we do it, it will work because people like this stuff. But I would say that teacher confidence and understanding where exactly you deploy these kinds of tools is the central element for using this kind of approach effectively. I hope this answered your question.
Okay, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Philip, may I invite you for your participation here? Philip?
Hi there. Yes, sorry. I'm actually outside. I had to travel to go and pick my daughter up. So yes, thank you very much for the invitation to attend. I thought the talk was very interesting. I'm always interested to learn the history. I think it's often overlooked, and you know we need to learn from our history. So just that aspect alone was definitely worthwhile. I think the distinction between gamification and using games for learning or learning from games, for me, struck a chord. There's a lot of discussion these days about just simply applying gamification to things. And I think that warning that that's overly simplistic is very helpful as well. So I very much enjoyed this session, and thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a lot better historians in the line of the next speakers in the ISAGA series, so I strongly hope you will be attending their sessions as well. I as I said in the beginning, like the trends, and we have people who know the games that have been done over these decades. So I hope a lot of people can join in the next sessions as well.
Absolutely. I'll certainly be doing that.
So, thank you. Thank you, Philip. Any other questions, please? Elena, Toshiko, Elizabeth.
I just wanted to say thank you to Thomas for the session. I really enjoy reviewing the history, and like Phil, I think we need to understand that, and particularly the coverage of the last 20 years has been particularly helpful for me, pulling those threads together. So no question, just a thank you. It was great.
Yeah, I think you're a better expert, like I just mentioned before, on several of the topics here. So this is high praise. Thank you.
It was good. I enjoyed it very much.
Any other questions, please?
Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead. Yes, Elena, go ahead.
I have a small question about the influence of religion. You talked about the influence of military games and medicine. What about the religion? I mean, the roots of gaming, as a root of gaming.
That's a very interesting topic, of which I know, frankly, too little. So in that area, we should be doing a lot more research, because one of the trends, especially in Western Europe, which is my own background, has been sort of that, for example, religion has been anti-gaming, as it has been anti-theater and other things like this. So we go back to the ideas of Max Weber and other sociologists who are saying that these are not combining together. But on the other hand, for example, in Finland, the first organizations that applied game-based learning here systematically were religious organizations. So our first theses that have been done on educational gaming here were in this area. And I am highly fascinated with this topic, and still have the email addresses of the authors. So we should probably be looking into this a lot more. But for example, like I mentioned, a lot of semi-secular organizations have also been using this approach a lot. But if we look at the background of the way in which Boy Scouts were actually gamified, we are seeing a lot of religious overtones over there, and this translated then to the works of people like Elkonen and others. So we are seeing transference here. Yeah.
And then how do we forget? There is a bishop in chess on the chessboard who acts virtually at cross purposes diagonally across the board.
Which of course is a mistranslation of a supposedly Indian game. So maybe the role was something completely different back in the day.
Thank you. Thank you. It was very interesting to hear you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Elena, I think we really need to look further into the issue of religion in this topic. So let's return to this.
Okay, okay.
Anyone else? We've had a fascinating discussion on a very fascinating topic, covering 5,500 of human history, into research, into practice, into research, into more research, into design, facilitation, debriefing, and what have you. What's left with me, in fact, I wanted to ask him about the future of both gaming and research, and he's asked to answer those questions very briefly. What's left with me is the fact that he said the objective of gaming is to provide a place where you can crash safely. Now, that's going to be something that's going to be remaining with me for a very, very long time. And thank you, Thomas. I mean, that's virtually the distilled effect of games, where I can crash safely and learn without embarrassment and without the fear of failure. I think that's probably a very great feature and potential of every game. Thank you for a very good session here. We have had an excellent panel of co-speakers present and past. I wish we had more questions and more time as well. This excellent webinar series has been made possible by the organizers of the ISAGA-2021 conference, which could have happened last year but did not, and therefore spawned this webinar series. We've had a dozen speakers so far, and Thomas, you're the lucky number 13 speaker for us. We have probably another 13 or more speakers for us. I hope all of you will be present at those sessions as well. It's rather sad that Dr. Upinder Dhar, the chairperson of the conference and the vice chancellor of the university, is not with us. He's busy and has been pulled away. He's come in the past, despite being busy. He's cancelled appointments and been present. And if not for his push and initiative, this conference and perhaps this web series would not have happened. Thanks to technology, thanks to Zoom, and thanks to all your presence here. I think we've had a wonderful time. Thanks to all the faculty members of the Sri Vaishnav University, led by, you can see Dr. Dubey out there. He's been a silent performer with his team. Sometimes Rupali comes in and does the announcements on all that, making all this possible. I hope to see you, all of you, in the next session. I'm honest, I forgot when it is. Probably it's about 2-3 weeks later. I hope all of you will be present there. Thank you very much. Good day, good evening, and see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To all the
Thank you. I'm thankful to all the participants. Today we have more than 266 participants. I'm thankful to them. I'm also thankful to all the panelists. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I once again request to all the participants who have listened to the session that to please fill the feedback form as mentioned in the chat box.
And Philip, we need to talk one day, very soon.
Yes, absolutely. Let's get in touch.
Just let me know, just send me a link and we can talk.
Okay, will do. Will do.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, everybody. Good to see all of you. Good to see you, Marcus.
Great to see you again. Love the presentation.
Thank you, Thomas. Thanks
Goodbye.
a lot. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, and bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Now
leave.
Yeah, thanks. You can stop the recording now, probably.